Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you and to our brilliant panelists here today. Quick intro from me. My name's Kirsty. I'm co-founder of Druthers Search. We are a diversity and inclusion executive search firm. We work with a range of organisations from startups to scale-ups that want to build D&I into their DNA from the start, and larger and more traditional businesses that want to diversify their business, usually within the technical, design, digital, product and people teams. We also provide D&I consultancy services to businesses so they can become more inclusive and equitable either before or during the recruitment process. We released a report last year with Colour in Tech, looking at the role of the Chief Diversity Officer in the US and comparing it to the same function in organisations here in the UK and in Europe. It's a job title that's been growing quickly. According to LinkedIn data, the number of people globally with the head of diversity title more than doubled over the last 5 years by 107%. Director of diversity grew by 75% and chief diversity officer by 68%. Organisations understand more and more the importance of D&I, not only from an internal perspective, but also the benefit it brings to the bottom line and how much their customers value it and in some cases require it. It's a subject talked about every day at Druthers, and it's what our business has been built around from the start 5 years ago. Before we start asking questions of our panel, I've written a few words to introduce the purpose of this webinar and the wider conversation. 2020 has brought and is still continuing to bring a huge amount of change to all of our lives and the way in which we do business. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. We can reflect back on some unbelievable things that have happened recently. The killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, which sparked worldwide protests and a huge surge of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement, originally founded in 2013. The impact of lockdown gave us insight into the true imbalance between men and women in the home, especially those trying to parent and homeschool whilst working during lockdown, and terrible stats around COVID deaths amongst BAME communities. That's a term that we will discuss later, by the way. With local lockdowns in areas across the UK, creating imbalance and confusion across regions. The huge impact of all of this on our mental health. Preliminary research from Mind suggests that 2/3 of adults and 3/4 of young people with experience of mental health problems said their mental health has got worse over this period, and 51% of adults and 55% of young people without experience of mental health problems have said their mental health has also declined. From an EDI perspective, some groups are facing greater challenges with their mental health. For example, again in reference to Mind's research, those with disabilities, learning difficulties or long-term illness, as well as women, non-binary people, parents and carers, people at higher risk, those shielding or those on their own, people experiencing social deprivation and people whose employment status has changed, whether they've been furloughed, have reduced hours or have experienced unemployment and are seeking work. As a result of all of this change, there has seemingly been huge shifts in the way organisations seem to be viewing D&I. We have seen a huge increase in companies looking to hire, often their first ever head of D&I, or they're speaking out about their beliefs in this area or talking about their plans for change. We want to make sure organisations aren't panic buying or performing a tick box exercise or just paying lip service. It's so important if you're hiring this person that you do it the right first time and do it with care and a long-term strategy in mind. It's not something to be rushed and can be so damaging to your brand if it's done incorrectly. The main question is though, how do you hire for a role that you've never hired before? That you've never had in your organisation, and neither have many of your competitors? What is the benchmark? Where should it sit? How important is it? And what do you expect them to do? Most importantly, how do you empower this person and set them up for success? I've invited Joyce Adeloye-Adams from Thomson Reuters, Cherie Atchison from Peakon, and Jay Matthew from Virgin Media here today to discuss and debate just that. If we could start with a small introduction from you all, that would be great. Cherie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Cherie Atchison, and I am the Global Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Peakon, which is an employee engagement platform. I previously held senior leadership DE&I roles at Monzo Bank and Deloitte. I'm a global ambassador for Women Who Code, which is the world's largest nonprofit globally dedicated to women in tech. I'm a Forbes contributor and also currently writing a book on demanding more on DE&I with Kogan Page Publishing.
Thank you. Jay?
Hi everyone, my name is Jay Muthu. I'm off mute, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm the Executive Director of Employee Experience at Virgin Media, which basically is, I'm responsible for all things talent, inclusion, leadership, and engagement at Virgin Media. Before coming to Virgin Media, I worked in organizations like Thomson Reuters and Monster. So I've worked in diversity and inclusion for the last 10 years and did some really path-breaking work in the space of disability because I have a personal lived experience of disability. I've been on a wheelchair all my life. I think walking is overrated. Be on a wheelchair, you'll have more fun. Okay. So that's my outlook towards life. And I'm very passionate about creating inclusive workplaces where each one of us can be ourselves and not have to really put on something which we are not. That's very, very important for me.
Thank you, Jay. And Joyce?
Yeah, as the introduction says, I'm Joyce Hadley-Adams. I'm the global editor for Newsroom Diversities at Reuters. My entire adult life, barring probably a minor stint in tech, has been in broadcasting. So I started as a program maker for several years before being asked to by the industry to sort of work on the strategy for the broadcast industry around diversity. So I know this very well. I've been doing it for such a long time, long enough to know all the pitfalls and long enough to know that we tend to talk far too much about it with far less action. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. So we've got loads of questions and maybe too many. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock and I'll make sure there's time towards the end for questions from the audience. But if people want to ask questions throughout, then please do, because if I see there are loads of questions piling in, then I'll obviously give more time to the audience because it's important that you get to ask what you want to ask as well. So I'm actually going to throw you around a little bit. I did give you each a question, but I might actually give you one that you haven't been given. So I'm sure you can all handle it. The first question I've got is to Cherie. If you were advising a CEO around how to improve diversity and inclusion with their organisation, what would you recommend?
Yeah, what I think is really important is embedding in accountability early on, ensuring that we're not just viewing this as something that focuses so heavily on community and not actually measurement and tracking how it's working. And we're seeing quite a lot of organizations sharing, for example, their diversity demographic data and using that as the benchmark of success, but actually not measuring their inclusiveness and what it means to actually work in the business, what people's different perceptions from different backgrounds actually means, and do they view a stronger sense of inclusion, belonging, non-discrimination, and so on, based on different protected characteristics and underrepresented groups. And I think whenever we are talking to senior leadership in C-suite about this, we must embed this down in the same way that you deliver accountability for example, your engineering strategy, your product strategy, etc. You spend the time understanding what you're trying to measure, how you're trying to measure, what success looks like, and also what failure looks like, and what you do when you do miss the mark and when you don't get where you're intending to go. And I think the important thing as well, advising C-suite on this, is to let them know that there will be changes coming that they won't like, because it is reworking the processes and the policies that will either have been created organically or not created with everybody in mind. Therefore, they need broken down and they need changed.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you say that, because it's not like, I'm just thinking about if you're interviewing for the role as a CEO, interviewing somebody, or someone in talent interviewing somebody for this person, it's not the same as sort of sales targets. It's not the same as rolling out a new product or a feature. You're dealing with human beings, and you're dealing with staff that might have a real hard time talking about some of this stuff. Some of it's really polarizing, and some of the issues are very nuanced, aren't they? So how would you recommend that a CEO or someone in talent would kind of measure in an interview whether this person could actually help them or do this job?
I think it's important to be willing to be very forward. I think you can't do leadership in DE&I roles if you're not willing to be blunt and ask the important questions, ask what those people are doing personally, ask what the organization is doing, ask why they are hiring this role for the first time. You mentioned that at the start. I was thinking about this last night. and I've been doing this for almost a decade as well. And the last 4 roles that I have held have all been first-time roles for the company. And it's important to drill down in what is the mission behind that role, who it answers to, why it answers to that person. But having that level of accountability and executive support is incredibly important. Now, I will say, what you hear in an interview isn't always necessarily what happens when you join an organization. And there will be times where those 2 things don't match up. But I think, interviewing them is as much as they are interviewing you is incredibly important.
Thank you. So that takes us on nicely to the next question, Jay. Why do you think D&I so often sits within HR? Who do you think should create the strategy?
Very good question, and also probably something which we might have polarized views, isn't it? So I sit in HR and I'm responsible for D&I in my organization, but I also have a strong accountability to a chief operating officer who is the sponsor for the belonging strategy. We call it belonging at Virgin Media, and it's been the case in most of my experiences. So from my perspective, what is important is not where it sits, but what influence it has. I think that's the most important question we need to ask. And a lot of times, to Sherry's earlier point, the individual who's playing the role of the head of D&I or chief diversity officer or whatever you call that has a significant impact on how they shape that role, because many a times lots of organizations have hired this role for the first time. There is no playbook. When you hire an employee relations leader, there is a clear playbook of what you do and what you don't do. But when you hire a D&I leader, you don't have a playbook. So I think what is important is the strategy formulation for D&I is steeped in the business strategy. That's the most important thing. And along with the business strategy, obviously, there is people strategy, isn't it? So people strategy is a component of the business strategy. So it can sit anywhere, but it should have a strong focus on people strategy. The second most important thing is the budgets for it. A lot of times when you're in HR, what happens is the budget is always, HR is the first place where budget cuts happen, isn't it? When any organization is looking at margins. So the way we've kind of formulated it this year is the D&I budget, I manage it, but it sits within the different business lines. So each business line has been made accountable to put a pot of money around diversity and inclusion. So so now my boss in HR cannot really take that money away to focus on something else because it sits in the business line, okay? And business has to be really accountable as to why they're doing that. So that's a great model which we've kind of evolved at Virgin Media, but I kind of own the budget, so I'm not really accountable. Not to HR on a day-to-day basis, but I know where to really invest this money on. The third thing is the leader of inclusion needs to be able to really go beyond in some HR organizations, they're very compliance focused, keeping the company safe, isn't it? And when you want to do something around diversity, one thing which we keep saying quite a lot at Virgin Media is being comfortable with the uncomfortable. If you want to really make a difference, you got to be really comfortable with being uncomfortable and doing those challenging things, which may go against the grain of what traditionally HR might look like. Okay. So the leader of inclusion needs to be someone who can really stand up and fight this battle. I think Sherry earlier mentioned one of the characteristics you need in a leader of inclusion is someone who is really hard-nosed, isn't it? Almost like a thick skin. You got to have thick skin to be able to be really successful and move beyond just the lip service which many organizations have done. So I think it doesn't really matter where it sits. It can sit in the business, report into the CEO, it can report into the chief people officer, but what it matters is how do you create your strategy? Where does those budgets sit? And how is the D&I leader, maybe in 50 years, it won't matter because it will be part of the DNA of organizations, but at least for the next 5 to 10 years, the D&I leader needs to be someone who can influence change in the C-suite, irrespective of where they report into.
I can see Joyce's face. She's desperate to talk. I know she's got a lot to say on this. And it's your question next, so you can give your comments on that, but also it's kind of related to the next question anyway. If you were to hire, if they do hire a head of D&I, who should that what should that person be? I'm so excited about your answer. What should that person be expected to do in terms of like team, budget?
Okay, so I'll respond first to the where it should sit. What I will say to Jay, is where it sits will determine the amount of influence that person will have. So for me, where it sits is incredibly important. And just to sort of backtrack a little bit to where we find ourselves right now and why we're talking about this right now, and where traditionally diversity and inclusion has always sat, which is in HR. And it is different in every organization, but I can go on my experiences and anecdotally from what people have told me. And if we were to measure success of where we are right now, in terms of the conversations we're having in systemic racism, etc., why we have to question where it sits. In the same way that as a D&I leader, we have to question everything and have a really critical mind, we should also question where it sits. Where does this sit? Where can you create the maximum impact? And is HR the best place for that, considering where we are right now in terms of success measures? Have we got to where we're supposed to be with HR having a hold on D&I? And then you have to ask the question, so why is that? So from my point of view, my role as editor, I report directly into the managing editor, and who reports directly into the editor-in-chief. I have weekly meetings with the editor-in-chief. I have weekly meetings with the guy who owns the money. I have weekly meetings with all the leadership, essentially. And I would not be able to do that if I sat in HR. I am part of the business. They see me as part of the business. They see me as a business leader. For me, that's really, really important. Also, in terms of the structures and the processes, you have to be in a position whereby you can hold HR also to account. You have to be able to question the systems, essentially, that may be hurting certain demographics and holding them back. So for me, where it sits is really important. I'm not saying that D&I and HR can't work, doesn't work, but what I am saying is that we have to question why we haven't got the success that we are all craving for right now, if it has traditionally sat in HR. So that's what I will say. And so we do have to question, we need to make sure that it is embedded within the business, the role itself, in order for people to see it as something that is embedded within the business, not part of HR that is done over here, that is done to people, that is, people shouldn't feel like D&I is being done to them. It needs to be very much part of the business. So that's what I would say on that. Sorry, Kirsty, I forgot your...
That's fine. It's something that everyone's a part of, isn't it? As you said. No, the question was, but it does lead on really. It's around, because we've been recruiting heads of D&I ourselves, and sometimes they get a budget, sometimes they have no real budget yet, but they're allowed to build a business case for one. Sometimes they don't have a team, but they can take resources from the HR team, for example, whether it's data analysts or whatever it might be. Some people, they do want them to grow a team. I mean, that's really the question. Do you think it's consistently so that this person should have a team and should have a budget, or do you think they could? Well,
it should be seen as a function that is within the business. So with every other function, you would have a budget, you would have a team. I would question any organization that says, here we are, we're all a bit woke now, let's face it, so, we want to employ somebody to head up D&I. Oh, but by the way, you have no team and you have no budget. I mean, to me, that's just nonsensical and just a red flag. I think it's incredibly important that if you are, if this is a priority for you, as you say it is, then you prioritize it in the same way that you would do any other business function. That's my view on that. I think the question you asked originally was, what in the role, what should you expect to do? Something along those lines. And for me, it's very different. It depends on the organization. My role, for instance, working in news would be very different to Jay's, will be very different to Cherie's. So the sort of end goal, as it were, to diversify, is probably, similar, but in terms of what we do on a day-to-day is very, very different, so it very much depends on the function. I look after, our journalists worldwide. Obviously I'm very much part of the leadership. So a big part of my role is holding them accountable, making sure they have objectives, and making sure they do what they say they're going to do, write the strategy with them for each of our regions. We've got a footprint in 200 locations. So I need to look at diversity you know, even though we have a global vision through a very regional lens, as diversity means different things to different people. So I've got to think about that. Obviously our coverage, you know, what underpins all of that is our data, making sure that our culture, you know, we tend to forget the inclusive part of this, but it's a culture of making sure that, you know, our culture is fit for purpose if we want people to stay and thrive. And then data, making sure that we have enough data to actually measure success and hold people accountable. So it does very much depend on the organization that you are with, which will determine what you do on a day-to-day. But I think you need to have a very clear understanding of what influence you have and what power you have to actually make the changes you need to make before you take on a role, from my perspective.
Thank you. Sherry, this is one that I've recruiting this role recently. I actually spoke to somebody who said that they're not sure whether in a year's time some of these roles that are being advertised now might actually be open again because they're new roles, because the hiring managers haven't hired this before. So many reasons, obviously. What do you think, you know, it's a silly question in a way, the average tenure of a head of D&I, obviously it should be forever, but how can employers make sure they've thought about long-term planning and not actually just be looking for someone to do like an interim role?
I think like you said at the start, we have seen a statistical increase in the number of leadership DE&I roles certainly in the last few months, the last sort of quarters, but also in the last few years. And I think it's important to think about what are the goals that people are trying to achieve with those things? Why are you trying to hire a head of DE&I? Is it because you're trying to, you know, put different measures in place to change things? Is it because of your brand and a marketing perspective? What is it what are you actually trying to do? Are you trying to diversify, for example, your product and the actual technology solutions that you provide? When you think about those kinds of things, it will determine how you're setting someone up for success. Now, the reason why we see a turnover in DE&I leadership roles and people in those roles is because they come in, they're, you know, painted a picture in the interview process, they believe they're being set up for success to really, really make change. They come in and they're like told, no, don't do that, don't do this, no budget, no nothing, sit down, be quiet, but we'll roll you out when it's International Women's Day or Black History Month. And every time, I had quite a lot of offers when I was moving it before I came to Peakon, and in every stage of the interview I made it very clear, I will never be the brown woman you roll out. So if you want to do this work and you want to be challenged, you want me to tell you, because again, I have weeklies with our executive, with our CEO and so on and so forth, and the people that hold all the budget, the people that give me the budget that I've asked for, etc. If you're having someone coming in and not setting them up for success, they will leave. Okay, and that's why we have quite a high turnover there, because organizations are hiring roles in a tokenistic way. Now, to make sure we're doing this and not doing that, there has to be a very frank conversation, an honest conversation with the people in C-suite that are looking to hire these roles. Now, if you do want to make meaningful change, understand what you're actually hiring for. What we're also seeing now is that there has been an influx of people proclaiming that they are experts or heads of DE&I without actually having never done this work, which then means that we are conflating passion for skill set and so on. C-suite don't know what they're hiring for because, like I said, they are hiring for roles that have never existed before for them, and therefore are not actually hiring for it in a strategic, impactful way, in the same way that you would hire for any other business leader. That is rigorous, that is clean cut, and that is very clear on what the skill set is that is needed and why it's needed. And that's why we see a strong turnover, because one, C-suite there's organizations that are tokenizing heads of DE&I, and two, we're not hiring people all of the time in the right way. So we're hiring people in and they're not set up for success because they don't have the skills that are needed to do this work. This work, as Joyce has said, is a business leadership role. It's why we sit in the different remits that we're sitting in. If you're viewing it as something that is sort of fluffy and, you know, vague and community style building, then you're not doing it right. And that's why we see this huge turnover. But I could talk about that for years. So
yeah, no, we could talk about all of this for years, couldn't we? It is an interesting one though, talking about the internal and the external piece as well, because sometimes it is very much the internal piece that people want to change or to look at trying to improve. But I think it's really important for candidates who go to these interviews to ask, you know, how much am I allowed to look at your product, and how much am I going to be able to influence what it is that we're actually doing out there, because that is just as important as the internal piece, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, and that for me personally, you know, the work that I do at Peakon is both internal DE&I and all the other stuff that we're focusing on, but actually how we influence and change our product. I oversee the product as a director as well, and define that vision, etc., to make sure that, you know, we're not just talking, but actually influencing, changing the product that affects, you know, thousands and thousands of companies. So yeah, that's important.
Joyce, what do you think Black Lives Matter will do for D&I as a function?
Well, as I said before, we're all a bit woke now. We're all suddenly embracing it, which on one hand is a good thing, but I think we all saw sort of the wave of company statements that suddenly went out, which I found really interesting. Some of the companies who in the past have not really embraced diversity in any real sense. But they suddenly felt the urge to say that they were with Black Lives Matter, and it was really important to them. So on one hand, I'm glad that all of Black Lives Matter now is important in most organizations. I think that is great. I think that's what Black Lives, the movement has done. I think systemic racism is finally under the spotlight, which is fantastic, which is why we really need to have honest conversations about what has not worked in the past and not gloss over it, because otherwise we won't make any sustainable change. I think for the first time, we are sort of really leaning into those really uncomfortable conversations about race and white privilege, which we've always been really uncomfortable to do. And I think that is only a good thing, as long as it is not just talking, that there's action built in amongst that talk as well. I think companies are now also recognizing, although the business case for diversity has been, long known, but I think, as I said, companies are now woke, and they've woken up to the fact that, it could affect their bottom line if they don't change now, hence all the statements. And also I think there is, certainly from my perspective, a bit more emphasis on action, which is a good thing. I hate talking shops. People who know me know that actually I shy away from committees and action groups and blah, 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 because actually they never action anything. So I think if we can actually move the needle now to actually do the work, I think would be a really good thing. But I think Black Lives Matter has had an impact for sure. I think, as you said, more and more companies now want to hire, a head of diversity or without really understanding what it means, as Cherie said. And I think we need to be really careful about that, because I think a company really does need to do some deep soul searching as to why now for them, why now? Why not last year? Why not the year before? And is this just a knee-jerk reaction to what has gone on, and how long will it last? We'll be sat here next year talking about the fact that we haven't moved the needle on, or is this just a sticky plaster that we've put on? Is it because it's public facing now, or do we actually want to do the work? And the work takes time, and it's going to be painful, and it's going to be long. And I think companies need to understand that diversity and inclusion is change management. So it does mean changing the setup within your organization, and are organizations prepared to do that?
Yeah, definitely. And, is it just like a trendy thing that, just like Me Too was a couple of years ago, it just, everyone starts like panicking, we need to get some more women. We go out and talking to clients on the technical side when we're looking for heads of engineering, heads of product, and they're often wanting us to help them find women. And before Black Lives Matter recently, when we could actually still go to meetings face to face with people, we would talk about how, we should look at race and ethnicity as well in our shortlist, not just try and find you women. And we'd actually have CTOs say to us, well, ethnicity is not really a problem in our organization. We just need women right now. And I really can't wait for my next pitch face to face with somebody who says, they won't say that now. I just think it's a huge change.
Hopefully.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But also, just in terms of Black Lives Matter, what I really do want to say very quickly is that, it's not about just getting more Black and brown faces in. I would like these companies that have put statements out. What I would say to you is, how many Black people do you actually have on your board? How many Black people do you actually have on your leadership team? You know, for me, you know, words are words, you know, demonstrate that by action. If you really want change, change the setup of your boards and your leadership team.
Absolutely, and I bet they won't. I bet the answer will be 0 most of the time. How much do you think the term BAME has helped or hindered the role of the head of D&I, Cherie?
The problem with the term BAME and categorizing and viewing, you know, people like that as a monolith is that, you know, people are not a monolith, and organizations are hiding behind the term. Now, my problem with that is that whenever we look at, say, ethnicity pay gap reporting, or reporting around, you know, your demographic data, when you do it without actually drilling down in, we know that there are different ethnicities, and primarily Black folks, that are left behind in the process. Now, what's happening there is that it's giving organizations, one, an ability to hide, and two, a false sense of security, which means that the work that needs to happen, like, you know, Joyce has mentioned around, you know, the systemic structural changes around your hiring, around who's in leadership on your board, and so on and so forth, is not happening. Now, what I think is important is that, and any of the reports, etc., that you'll have seen that I have written, that drill down into the representation of different ethnicities across the organization, depending on the office and depending, you know, protecting anonymity, depending on the size of the office, etc., is incredibly important. But you should be reporting on those different breakdowns throughout, and alongside the census data. So you are not hiding the truth. You're not pretending that, you know, you're doing actually great work because you have, let's say, you committed to have, I don't know, 25% of partners by 2030 who are BAME, but actually having that more granularity of the data. And I think it has opened up a conversation for sure, which has been good. You know, whenever people started to talk about BAME years ago, it started to open up the conversation, but it started to open it up whilst also embedding in other elements of exclusion, because it's hidden accountability, and it's hidden and given people a way to shy behind what's actually happening. Now, we have seen, you know, quite a lot of organizations since this summer, and since the mobilization of the different Black Lives Matter movements around the world, to start, you know, edge out into sharing, you know, their actual Black demographic data, etc. But we have to do that, otherwise, you know, you're being facetious, to be honest.
Yeah, can I just say on that, you know, I think the term BAME is a problem. You know, as Cherie says, I think if you drill down into the data, I think a lot of companies hide behind it. You drill down into the data, you will find that, you know, Black people are not represented much at all. You know, certainly from my perspective, when we have targets, we have ethnicity targets, we have targets specifically on Black representation in leadership. I think you just need to call it out. I think now is the time when we should be making very honest changes rather than hiding behind whatever we can hide behind. And we've also committed to publishing our diversity data every year from this year, which will break down into the very different demographics. We're a global organization, so for us, the term BAME doesn't really mean anything outside of the UK. You know, so I think it's really important that we start having a conversation about whether or not that term actually helps or hinders certain demographics when it comes to diversity.
Thank you. Jay, how do you think a head of D&I, somebody in this role, could help a culture internally?
You know, I think Cherie and Joyce both mentioned that D&I is actually change management, but I also feel diversity and inclusion is actually a culture transformation in an organization, because if the organization was very homogeneous for a long period of time, the culture would also be very homogeneous. It would be the kind of culture which the leadership in the organization and the majority of the people in the organization live, isn't it? So the moment the organization goes on the journey of real diversity and inclusion, if you really want to make the organization diverse, when you bring in different people, it is important to recognize that if you hire people who are different, they will behave differently, isn't it? One of the things when we hire is hire for culture fit, which I think is probably the best way to keep your organization as homogeneous as possible, because everyone talks, walks, and speaks the same way like everyone around them. So it is really important for the D&I leader to believe that they are a culture change leader rather than just a diversity inclusion leader, because a lot of things change in the organization when different kinds of people come in, right from the way the physical infrastructure of the organization is, right from the way the meetings are done, right from way informal networking and informal groups get created, will change when different people of different demographics kind of come into the organization. So, and many organizations are not prepared for that, isn't it? Because organizations like the familiarity of what they are comfortable with, and the moment when there is a different kind of person in the boardroom and they start asking questions, you see the tension happening there, isn't it? And that's where the CEO and the senior leadership in the organization first need to go through this journey as to why they are doing this. For example, at Virgin Media, we are a UK only business. So in the past, our leadership team was quite local, okay, but in the last couple of years we've really transformed, and our leadership is quite global and reasonably representative of how the UK business is. And though some of the conversations in the boardroom are a bit uncomfortable, because the people who've been there and used to a particular way are like, oh, I don't understand what this individual is saying, I don't really get it. And that's where I think the role of the D&I leader becomes important, to really play that the glue which changes the culture. Will it happen in 6 months' time? Absolutely not. And that's where I kind of laugh when people talk about interim D&I roles, isn't it? So my request to them is, guys, if you want to do this as a band-aid, the best thing to do is not to do it. Okay? Really don't do it. And say, I'm very happy our business is making the money it needs to make with the kind of demographics we have. I don't really want to reflect the customer base, because our customers are a particular kind and they are giving us the business. So don't do it. Don't do this interim stuff, because any of this culture change, we all know, takes a long time. And especially changing systemic bias, which is there in the world, takes longer than just making organization culture change.
Absolutely. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself for a minute then. Oh, I love technology. Joyce, I'm going to ask you a question now, and I'm going to actually put two together around, we talked before about the ethnicity.
You're going to put two together.
Well, Cherie, I mean, all of you can obviously join in, but we talked about the ethnicity pay gap last time we spoke, and I know that it was talked about by lots of people last year, and obviously COVID seems to have put a bit of a halt to the reporting of that. Do you think ethnicity pay gap will have the same impact as the gender pay gap did? And I guess also part of that question is, why do you think gender has always been more of an issue than race for organisations that are trying to be more inclusive?
I'll answer the second one first. I think gender is just easier, I think if you're, and also I think that, look, when I first started at Reuters, when they talked about diversity, they talked just about gender, and I questioned that as soon as I came in. And I think, and the same thing in tech, as you said, it's the focus is on gender. I've never really understood it. You can't say diversity and gender in the same breath. Diversity goes far beyond gender diversity. So that was always odd to me. But I do think it's as simple as, it's easier. You don't really need to necessarily try as hard as you would have to try if you were to focus on ethnicity and race. So I think that's the answer. And also, I think race makes people feel uncomfortable, because it also makes you question your own sort of unconscious bias and so I think, with gender, they don't have to deal with any of that. That is the honest truth. So I think what's happened now is people are faced, as I said before, with having to talk about it and deal with it in a way that they haven't had to before, which I think is a really good thing. In terms of the ethnicity pay gap reporting, I think it will have a massive impact, probably more than gender, actually. I think, your gap is very much dependent on not just the amount of Black people you have in the organization, but how many sit within leadership, because that is going to determine your gap. And we know that that gap is going to be far greater than gender, which will again spark another round of conversations about what are we doing, why have we allowed this to happen for so long, and how are we going to fix it. So I do think that this is I think the ethnicity pay gap reporting will only enhance this discussion and only sort of empower us a bit more to actually make the changes that we need to make, because it's very public facing, those reporting. You know, so you'll be able to download the company's report and read where they are. And also in those reports, you have to demonstrate what you're doing to try and fix the gap. So I think it's going to be a really important part of this narrative, I think. And we shouldn't underestimate it. And my advice to any company right now is get your ducks in line, because the ethnicity reporting, it's coming, whether you like it or not. And there'll be a renewed emphasis on it due to what's happened this summer. So, if you haven't got or are not starting to think about, diversifying your organization, it's only going to look really bad on you when you have to publicly report.
Can I jump in, Kirsty?
Either of you can, yeah. Jay first.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of answer the question around the second part, why we only focus on gender and now ethnicity. I think that's been a problem of the practitioners like us, isn't it? We've always looked at diversity in terms of different pillars. Organizations have always looked at it that way, which is not really helped move the needle. And what that really does is leave the people who are not part of that demographic outside the conversation, and that's when change does not happen. Like, for example, as Joyce mentioned, the race conversation is uncomfortable. More than the race conversation, for example, the disability conversation is uncomfortable and challenging, and a lot of people are unaware. Same with the LGBTQ plus conversation, isn't it? Okay. So organizations don't really deal with those kind of uncomfortable conversations, where gender is probably slightly easier. I'm not saying it's easy, and that's why it has happened. As long as we keep looking at diversity in these kind of buckets or silos, real change will not happen, because all of us come in multiple shapes and forms, isn't it? And it's very, very important that the organization start embracing all those different forms and shapes of people and look at it. Because if you were to look at disability, for example, 15% of the world has some form of a disability, which is as much as the population of India, so are you going to exclude a population as big as India from the economic mainstream? I think that would be ridiculous to do, so isn't it? So it's very, very important that when you talk about diversity, you really think about what don't have in my organization, which I need to bring in. And that's when you will make true difference and start reflecting the society and the customer base you're part of. From an ethnicity pay gap perspective, again, I think granular reporting will be important, because if you were to, especially in UK with the BAME umbrella terminology we have, that could give you a lot of skewed data, because we know, and I don't have statistics to quote, but anecdotally, you know that people from Indian origin are probably in slightly better roles, but they are also BAME, isn't it? Okay. But if you were to look at Black or Pakistani or Bangladeshi dimensions, they're probably not. Okay. So the Indian demographic could push up the ethnicity pay gap if you were to look at it as BAME, which is probably what the government will start with, but organizations need to start looking at it more granularly.
Yeah, what I think is important, and I guess touching on why the industry is focused so heavily on gender, is that people, and this might sound quite harsh, but people are inherently selfish, okay? And it's things that we have to combat in ourselves when we care, about our own self needs, etc. And when you have the primary people in, for example, leadership roles, or in the DE&I leadership roles, or if it sits in HR, your HR teams are primarily white and white women, you have to think about how that influences what gets done and why it gets done. Now, I think we have seen that white women, for example, and white able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgendered women have benefited the most from the impact of DE&I strategies over the past number of years. And what I think is important to note about that is because those are the people that senior leadership, for the most part, are directly relating with. So it's easier, it's more comfortable to bring those people into the conversations, as opposed to the other areas around neurodiversity, around disability, around ethnicity, around working parents and caregivers, and all of the other things that we have to be looking at. And now I've just joined the company I'm at now. It's my 5th week, and I've been doing this in other places, but we are now making sure that we're embedding down and capturing that demographic data across all of these different characteristics. So as we scale, and we're a global business, but we're still only 230 people, as we scale, we have those processes embedded and ready for intersectional reporting when the data set size is big enough to protect anonymity. But you have to build for scale. What you can't do is just prioritize gender now and then later on hope for the best. You got to build in your tooling, in your data analysis, etc., for scale and how you grow, especially in tech product style businesses that will scale. There are some businesses that won't scale, but for the most part, most of us will scale. And I think it's important that we are capturing things around neurodiversity, disability, and so on and so forth, not just creating another element of exclusion, which is what has happened now.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about not just from a recruitment perspective, but from sort of promotions perspective around terrible stat. I think white men are at the top of the chart, obviously most of the time, around 8. They normally get around 8 promotions in their working career, where a black man who's at the bottom usually has 1 or 2 promotions. So looking at those organizations that if they actually do look hard at the people they've got in their organizations that actually have been overlooked when it comes to promotions.
Can I just say, it's important to say this, and I say it all the time, because I have to reassure. There is a place for white men, so let's not.
I know, I'm married to one.
Me too.
my ex-husband was white. So there is a place for white men. So I don't want people to think that diversity is a zero-sum game. And I think that's also a really important message to get across. It's not we're moving in one direction at the expense of another. It's more about making sure that everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Oh, totally agree. And I've also got 3 small white boys that I look after most days of my life. And it's not about sort of it's all about inclusivity, right? It's about making sure everybody feels they've got a place. It just so happens that about 70% of the workforce is white men. So if we're going to, or maybe it's more than that, but if we're going to, depending which area you're looking at, I guess, but if we're going to try and make changes, you have to be harder on the other areas, really, just to make sure if it ever does become balanced. We're running fairly to time, but I think there's a couple of questions coming in. And one of them's actually similar to one of my questions around backgrounds of these people. So, from our research, from candidates we speak to, it seems like around 33% or so come from sort of HR backgrounds, whether it's org design, org development. About 30% come from talent acquisition. As someone from talent acquisition, I find that quite kind of concerning personally. 25% or so come from sort of corporate social background. Around 17% come from legal backgrounds. What would you think is a really interesting background if you were hiring a head of D&I?
What I think, I'm also surprised at that talent acquisition one as well, but I'm also not surprised because so many organizations view DE&I leadership as fixing hiring whenever they're actually not understanding the inclusiveness and what the culture means and all the other bits and pieces that we've talked about around your product and tech. And what I think is important here is that there is a blend of all of these different things, but stakeholder management is incredibly important because you have to, each of us have said, you have to push and you have to push hard quite a lot of the time. And you have to be able to do that in a way that makes sense for the different people that you are speaking to. And I think that's a really key part here. You also have to understand data and be able to be comfortable working with data. Now, very often we see DE&I professionals that are not comfortable doing that and then rely so heavily on community engagement that actually the data falls to the side whenever, certainly in my view, everything I do is data driven because it backs up exactly what I am saying. I will show you that because of our data, we're saying, for example, oh, we're not promoting people fairly because our data is telling us we're not, even if we've done these other things. So how do we rework that and so on? And I think data is an incredibly important part of this. What I also think is that we can't just assume that lived experience, for example, is enough to do this work. And I've already talked about this, and we see this more and more often with people becoming sort of self-proclaimed DE&I heads and leaders, etc. without having actually ever developed a strategy that came to fruition with key milestones, key goals, key progress indicators, key measurements that they've been able to report on, whether it's year, on quarter, whatever it might be, to make sure that they are driving accountability. And like each one of us has driven this point home, this is a business role. So you shouldn't just fill it just because you like how someone speaks about something. You got to see the proof. You got to see how they've delivered something in the past and how that would, shape to your own organization.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Sherry mentioned, for me, this is someone who understands business and understands the world around you is very, very important. You got to be someone who is intellectually curious. If you don't have curiosity, you shouldn't be in the D&I space, in my view. The second thing you need to probably have is transformation, because this is about changing things which have inherently wrong in the system, isn't it? So, and transformation, people talk about IT transformation, business transformation, etc. This is true cultural transformation. So you need to have the bone for transformation. And there are certain attributes, I think, which are very, very important. One is the ability to challenge, ability to influence, sometimes almost the ability to evangelize, isn't it? And evangelize stroke advocate is very, very important, especially in the early days in an organization which genuinely wants to make the change but doesn't know how to do it. So you need to kind of play the role of an evangelist and advocate within the organization, and hopefully things will change through that. And the last thing which you definitely need is the ability to manage change, because as things start evolving within the organization, people will look for direction. Okay, what does this mean? I've now brought in 4 Black people, but I don't know how to really manage them because I've never done that before. So you need to really help the organization go through that change journey as well. So it doesn't really matter where you come from, okay? As long as you have certain of these attributes, I think it's perfectly fine. I always worry when people from the legal background take diversity roles. That's my bigger worry, because the legal world is all about rule books, isn't it? And you have a particular job which is to protect the company or protect the rule of the law. But diversity sometimes is about really shaking the things which you have long held beliefs, okay? And sometimes you might get a bit of conservatism from the legal professionals than in other areas.
Thank you. Another question's come in, and it's actually another area that I have seen people that have come from in the past. They're in marketing at the moment, but they're a real activist within DE&I. And I, from my perspective, I think marketing is a really interesting place for someone to have come from, because they're thinking of the product, or they're thinking of their customer. So they're thinking of what, Jacqueline de Rocas always says, when she goes to see a new business, she'll look at the people in the room and then she'll think about the customer and whether that reflection of the room is the right reflection of the customer they're selling that product to. If someone was working in marketing, do you think, and they really wanted to work in the head of D&I role, do you think there's something they should be doing in terms of training or certification?
Look, I think it's very much dependent, again, on the industry that this person wants to go in. Just listening to the last the answers before, I could give a very different answer about what a successful person who works in D&I would look like in the newsroom, for instance. It would be very different. Journalists by our very nature, we're very cynical beings. So if you come in and you're talking corporate jargon, you'll get laughed out of the room. So you are going to have to be able to adapt to the situation that you're in. And credibility, certainly from my perspective in the newsroom, goes a long way, because if they feel that you are part of them and you understand them and you understand their language and you understand, what it's like to be a journalist in the field, I think that makes a big difference in terms of me influencing things getting done and working with the regional editors and putting strategies in place for their regions. So I think I think it very much depends on the area that you want to go in. I think being an activist is great, but as we've all said, this is about business. You know, so you need to understand the business that you're going in. Just being an activist, if you know, in a newsroom won't get you anywhere. You need to understand the business of journalism. You know, so don't think it's a softer role. If you're going to do it well, you need to really embed yourself within the business, and that means really, you know, schooling yourself on you know, the business that you're going into, from, you know, the product. What is the product? What is the kind of journalism that, you know, Reuters are putting out there? Who is the target audience? What is the reach? All of that stuff is really, really important. What are the different demographics? Who are the regional editors? You know, what are they writing? What are the biggest stories? All of that, I would, if I'm interviewing, would ask the D&I person the same questions that I would ask a budding journalist. What do you read? You know, what, you know, all of that stuff. So you really need to school yourself on the area that you want to go in, the business area, not just be an activist.
It's so true. And in our report, which I can share with everybody, by the way, if you want to, we'll be in touch with you after this, but we can share the report with you. We talk about the different types of D&I, heads of D&I, and we talk a lot about sort of the doer versus the activist or campaigner. And I think they have their place. They all have their place. It's just depending on sort of what that company might need. So we have 2 minutes left, so I'll wrap up now. Thank you so much to all of you for joining the conversation today. Really appreciate your time so much. Some of the takeaways from the discussion, I think Jay talking about how you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, that it's not something that's being done to us, as Joy said, it's an integral part of the core of every business. I think Cherie said, if you're viewing D&I as a fluffy nice to have, you're doing it wrong. This requires honest and frank conversation. I think you'll all feel we could have spoken for hours about this, and it's obviously part of a much larger ongoing conversation. But more important than the conversation, as Joy said, is about action. So let's go out there and try and make some change.
Absolutely.
But thanks again to everyone, and thanks to everyone that joined today to watch us.
Thank you.
Kirsty.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Have
Bye.
a nice weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.